I used to work for the Kentucky Division of Water, but that's not really when my interest in springs and spring houses started. When I was 14 years old, I got an interest in exploring caves. And so I joined the Bluegrass chapter of the National Speleological Society at that time. That was 1967. And so that group had field trips all over the state. And so I was very interested in exploring caves and learning about caves, but I also developed an interest in springs because springs are the discharge points for underground water systems. You know, some caves have a big stream of water coming out of them, some do not. And as my education developed and my interests matured, I also developed an interest in the way people used these natural springs and the sort of modifications that they made in order to best access the water and to protect the source. Now, when I worked for Division of Water, you know, I spent a lot of time in the office, but I was fortunate to also spend a lot of time out in the field. They sent me all over the state talking to landowners about groundwater issues, and every time I saw a spring, I would photograph it and I would document it and I would fill out a form. At last count, I think I had investigated somewhere in the neighborhood of 700 springs across the state of Kentucky. Now, the majority of those were in Bourbon and Scott County. I wanted to cover a couple of areas rather intensely, you know, try to get every spring and get a good picture of the spring house architecture in a particular region. And so I thought I'd start in the bluegrass. Well, I soon realized that, let's see, it takes me a year or two to do a county. Kentucky has 120 counties. There's got to be a cutoff here somewhere. So I managed to actually do a pretty thorough assessment of springs and spring houses in 3 different counties: Scott, Bourbon, and Rockcastle County. But I'm going to go ahead and get into this presentation now. What you're seeing in front of you there, out of all of these spring houses that I have seen in Kentucky, I think the finest example of spring house architecture is to be found right here in Scott County. This is just on the outside of Georgetown off of Lyle Road. And I'm going to talk a lot more about this when we get further into the presentation. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the context. Natural springs are abundant throughout Kentucky. I mean, you know, I said I saw 700 springs. 300 of those were in Bourbon County and about 80 or 90 of them in Scott County. And that's just, that doesn't even touch how many springs are in Kentucky. If you wanted me to guess how many, 50,000, 100,000 natural springs, it's impossible to make an estimate. But this is made possible by the particular geology that we find in Kentucky. These natural springs develop, or these groundwater flow systems develop in limestone bedrock. And the geology of Kentucky is underlain, about 50% of the state is underlain by limestone bedrock. So those areas that you see in blue are where we're going to find springs that are the most abundant. Elsewhere in the state, we've got sandstone, and springs do occur in sandstone, but they're generally just trickles, not really something that would make a good water supply. But the early pioneers that came into this area, they recognized the importance of these springs as water supplies that could supply households and even communities. So, in the settlement period of Kentucky, as I said, the settlers came in here, and the importance of springs cannot be understated. First, there were mineral springs, saltwater springs. And these saltwater springs attracted game animals, large animals like bison, buffalo, deer, elk, and so on. And they trampled wide trails from salt spring to salt spring all over Kentucky. And it was these buffalo trails that the early pioneers came into Kentucky and followed. And where off of the trails they would find freshwater springs that they chose for house sites, for settlement sites. So the pattern of exploration depended upon these buffalo trails. Also, these springs provided salt. By boiling the water down, they could provide a necessary item for their diet. And in fact, probably many of you have heard about how Daniel Boone was captured at Blue Licks when he was making salt with a number of other settlers. You know, the Indians came up, surprised Boone, and forced him to lead them back to the other men who were making salt, captured them all, later escaped. Now, these were also landmarks in the wilderness. Some of these springs, the mineral springs in particular, but also some of the larger freshwater springs, were well known to the explorers that were coming into the region. And they would use them as directional waypoints. They would say, well, I'll meet you at John Todd Spring, next March or something like that, because everybody knew where that was. And they became the sites for the first settlements. Pretty much every station, every settlement that was planted in the Bluegrass region, every community, every city that was founded here owes its location to the presence of a spring. When the settlers came to this country, there were two things that they wanted. They intended to be agriculturists. They wanted to be farmers. That's why they came here to this land to settle. And there were two things that were key to their success that they looked for. They looked for fertile soils, had no trouble finding that. But the second most important criteria was the presence of a good freshwater spring that could supply their families and their livestock. So the settlement, basically, the pattern of settlement depended upon where were the springs. And then finally, as the region was settled and developed, many of these larger springs provided water power to turn mills. That was particularly true for Royal Spring. There was a whole series of mills down the spring branch from Royal Spring during the early days of the community. All right, now this is just an example showing some of these buffalo trails. The game trails, these were the entry points into the region. The settlers that came down, or the pioneers, the explorers, the surveyors and settlers that came down the Ohio River, they would land at places like Maysville or up in northern Kentucky, and they would follow the game trails down into the Bluegrass area, or up from Cumberland Gap and into the Bluegrass and into the central and western parts of the state. Okay, here we can see the pattern of stations that was established here in the Bluegrass region. And again, remember that every single one of these stations was set up at a spring that was viewed as being large enough that it could supply at least a family, or in some cases, an entire community. Of course, the spring that is of greatest interest to all of us is Royal Spring, that was settled by John McClellan, first claimed by John Floyd. And then McClellan, not knowing that Floyd had already claimed the land, planted a station there, not knowing he was trespassing. And then Floyd agreed to sell the land to him. This is one of the best quotes that I have found in the Draper manuscripts. That's a record that was compiled by Lyman Draper, who interviewed hundreds of early settlers and their descendants. And this fellow Samuel Matthews pretty much described how Kentucky was settled. It was common for 4 or 5 families to be settled together by some good spring. Now, most of the settlers first would come to one of the large public forts, like Fort Herod or Boonesboro, because that's where they had safety and security in the wilderness. This is where they could first become oriented to the new land. They could talk to other migrants and some of the hunters and explorers who were in the region, who could sort of acquaint them with what conditions were like in this new land. So they would settle in for a few weeks or a few months. They would go out when they felt safe enough to do so and explore land, survey it, set up markers, blaze trees, make land claims, and then basically, make a few improvements on which basis they could apply for a land claim to the Virginia government, and then scuttle back to the safety of Boonesboro or Fort Herod or Logan's Fort, particularly if the threat of Indian hostilities had grown at the time. Here's an example of a land claim. I did search the Kentucky Land Office for a Scott County record, but I had trouble finding one that would be a good example, so I just thought I'd use William McConnell's claim to the McConnell Spring, which is the spring just west of Lexington, where the site of Lexington was first named back in 1775, I believe it was. And then Lexington was actually settled 4 years later in 1779 at a different spring about a mile to the east. But what McConnell did is he purchased from the government a land warrant, which authorized him to survey a certain number of acres in the wilderness. It didn't specify where it was. He could do his own selection as to where he wanted to pick that land. And of course, when he had it surveyed, he had to have his ear on the ground and his eyes open to make sure that he was not infringing on somebody else's previous land claim, which was difficult to do because they were basically trying to lay off boundaries in a wilderness of trees. And it might be very difficult sometimes to spot a marker that somebody else had made in the wilderness. And for that reason, this basically enriched several generations of lawyers through litigation in the courts. There were all sorts of overlapping land claims. Now, this is the property that he surveyed and is described in the text here. Now, as I said, I'm not going to say every single city in Kentucky or even in the Bluegrass was settled at a spring, but it's going to be the vast majority were settled at a spring, because when the pioneers came in and wanted to set up a community, they knew they needed a water supply. Springs historically have been perceived as the cleanest, purest form of water. That's not always true today, but that has been a historic perception for thousands of years. So these are some of the communities in Kentucky that were set up at a spring. You know, the major communities in the inner Bluegrass region. Now, the methodology that I used I've already kind of mentioned a little bit about what I was doing, but essentially I worked for the Division of Water for about 11 years. I spent a lot of time in the field, traveled across the state, spoke with landowners, talked with them about, contamination issues or other problems they might have with groundwater, springs, and so on. And while I was in the process of doing that, I would document every spring that I came across. So I ended up with data for 700 springs in 32 of the counties of Kentucky. Most of my efforts were focused in Bourbon, Rockcastle, and Scott. That was sort of a deliberate effort on my part because I wanted to try to get a good picture of water usage during the settlement and early 19th century years in a number of counties. So did Bourbon, Rockcastle, and Scott, and I did different techniques in each one. In Rockcastle County, that's where I started first, actually years before I worked for the Division of Water. Now, Rockcastle County is a mountainous area. It's covered in a heavy forest. So you can't just see springs, from the road. And the roads aren't very good at that, at least not back in the 70s when I first started going down there. So my method for locating springs was literally to walk the creeks. And when I say walk the creeks, I mean walk in the creeks. Because I would wade down the middle of a creek, every branch knee deep in water sometimes a little more, and I would just look for water coming in from one side or the other. And if it was cold water coming in, that told me that was probably a spring. So I would follow it up to the source and note the location and description. Now, Scott County was the second major effort that I made, and that was basically a windshield survey. Basically, I drove down most of the roads in Scott County, and if I could see a spring house from the road, I would go talk to the landowner. Now, Bourbon County was my most intensive effort in that I actually went to every single address in 3/4 of the county and asked them if they had a spring on their property. I mean, this took a long time. Most all of the year 1999 I spent in Bourbon County. And sure enough, 363 springs in 3/4 of the county. And I'm sure that number would be at least equaled by Scott County if I had done a more intensive survey, that got off of the main roads and was actually going into the back of the farms and so on. I'd say easily that both Bourbon County and Scott County have at least 500 springs apiece. There's no doubt in my mind. All right. Also, I helped to establish the Kentucky Groundwater Monitoring Network by going out and finding springs in various parts of the state that the owners would allow the Division of Water to take routine water samples and test them for contaminants like pesticides, metals, nitrates, fecal coliform, things like that, just to kind of get a good picture of the quality of groundwater in the state. And that monitoring network is still going on at the present time. You know, I had a part in setting that up, and so I'm kind of proud of that. Now, this is the form that I used. I designed that form myself, and basically it has owner information, the location of the spring in that second box, some of the characteristics of the spring, whether dye traces have been made to determine where the water goes or comes from, then kind of a sketch of the property area. Sometimes that would just be showing the location of the spring or spring house in relation to its surroundings. Sometimes I would do detailed drawings of the actual spring house. Okay, so let me talk about spring modifications. You know, a spring in its natural state is really not all that useful. If you want to go dip water out of a spring, chances are you're going to end up with a bucket that's half gravel and half water. So that's one reason. Another reason is that livestock like to walk around in springs. You don't really want cows walking around in your drinking water. You know, there's a lot of reasons. These are some of them. Why modify a spring? Okay, to focus or increase the natural flow. You know, clean out the spring, dredge it out. I wrote an article, which you can find on my website, about the early water supply in Lexington, Kentucky, going back to the pioneer era. And when Lexington was settled, there was not enough spring water to go around. They had a public spring and 3 or 4 other springs around, but they just weren't supplying enough water for the community. So one of the old residents recalled that they started digging at all the seeps, you know, coming out of the banks of Town Branch, and opened up new springs by doing so. So that might fall into this category of trying to increase the natural flow. To impound water for dipping, you know, create some sort of pool that you could drop a bucket into, you know, scoop up some water and carry back to your house. Some sort of impoundment for storage. In Rockcastle County, which is, you know, again, rural mountainous area, a lot of the residents will pipe water from a spring into some sort of storage tank. A lot of them will buy septic tanks, you know, brand new ones, unused, and use that as a water storage reservoir, and then have a pump that pumps the water out of that tank into their homes. Protect the source from debris, things washing in, leaves, dirt, so on, or from being trampled by livestock. Springs also provided natural refrigeration. The temperature of groundwater coming out of the ground is about 55 degrees. That's the natural underground temperature. The temperature of a cave in a region is basically the average annual temperature for that region. Here in Kentucky, that's about 52 to 55 degrees. You go up to Minnesota, you know, or let's say New York, because I don't know if Minnesota has any caves. I don't think so. New York has some caves, and so the temperature of those caves is going to be like 48 to 50 degrees, cooler climate. You go down to caves in Georgia, you're going to find temperatures inside those caves are going to be up around 60 degrees, so it's dependent upon the annual temperature. Well, 55 degrees is not really adequate refrigeration, but it's better than nothing. And so people would put perishables like fruit, cans of milk, and so on, and they would set them in the spring water. And of course, you may have read about people putting watermelons in springs for 4th of July picnics to kind of chill them. Now, it doesn't always work all that well. There was an event in Louisville back in I think the late 19th century, where they had put some potato salad in a spring house, but they made a mistake. It didn't chill it enough, and they left it in there too long, and so it made the entire wedding party sick. I think you can find that in the Encyclopedia of Louisville, if anybody runs across a copy of that. All right, so temporary refrigeration, harness water flow for power, particularly if this is a spring with a good drop in elevation so that the water is moving pretty fast, or can have a dam built across it, you know, with the water coming across the top to put in a mill wheel. Channel the flow to reduce marshland, basically dry out the ground around it by putting that flow into a distinct channel instead of sort of spreading out and making marshy ground. For many people, an elegant, well-built spring house was a symbolic statement of wealth and prosperity. Most people just threw some rocks together to protect the enclosure, and with that they were done. But some of the big landowners, those that had a lot of money, would put as much work into their spring house as they did into their residence. And finally today we see some spring houses that have deteriorated but are historically significant or associated with a historically significant property are being restored or reconstructed. Okay, so let's talk about the ways that springs are modified. Okay, spring houses are what is called vernacular architecture. This differs from commercial architecture. Commercial architecture, it all looks the same. If you're looking for a McDonald's, you know they all look the same. It doesn't matter what city you go to, with some minor variations, every McDonald's look the same. If you go into a subdivision and look at subdivision houses, they all look the same. You know, a few basic variations on sort of standard plans. Now, vernacular architecture is essentially where the owner will design something according to his own or her own personal tastes and needs. Essentially, it's based on whatever happens to, what's the local tradition involved. You know, how do people build particular things? These spring houses can be considered an outbuilding, like a barn or a root cellar or something like that. So local traditions are going to help dictate how those are built. Now, one thing that was interesting is that many years ago I was showing some slides of Kentucky spring houses to some people that I knew, and they went, wow, you know, these look exactly like those in Ireland. I mean, this is the same landscape, the same kind of building structures. And that makes sense because we had Scots-Irish masons that immigrated to the United States, you know, early in its history. And it was these masons that built our stone walls, our rock walls, and our major rock buildings and spring houses, most of which are built out of the native rock. Okay, so what materials were available and what's the particular site situation? So they're basically functional. The basic idea of a spring is to protect or improve the water supply. But beyond that, anything goes. Whatever the owner's taste in design, whatever their ideas are, that's the kind of spring house they end up with. It might be very, very simple. The owner doesn't want to put the money into it, doesn't want to put the labor into it. So stacks up a few rocks or some concrete blocks, may or may not put a slab of rock over top or some kind of roof, or may not. Okay, now what kind of materials are used? Well, most of them are rock. Some of them have some of them might be built out of wood. Some of the rock ones may have wood structures on top of a rock foundation. But one thing that rather surprised me is that I've seen almost no brick spring houses, maybe only a couple of brick spring houses out of that 700 that I've seen. Evidently, rock was just the easiest building material to work with. Okay, those materials were used from the pioneer era and still being used to modify springs. Now, later on in the late 19th century, we started to see springs being modified or new structures built using concrete or sheet metal. And in the 20th century, with the advent of concrete block and fiberglass sheeting, those were also used to modify springs. And so what we end up with is that since springs, any particular spring, and again, this is particularly true for agricultural springs on agricultural land, they have remained valuable for centuries, literally. And so they are modified and improved over many generations of families that own that land because they want to keep them intact, want to keep them functional. Okay, now, here in the bluegrass, we have relatively thin bedded limestone. It exists in thin layers. If you were to go, say, to southern Kentucky or to the Mammoth Cave area, limestone rock in those areas is in beds that are several feet thick. You know, you can't tear those up into building blocks very easily, but you can pry up these thin-bedded limestones pretty easily. And in fact, a lot of the limestone masonry, was the result of the settlers prying up slabs of bedrock from stream beds, because that's just the easiest place to access it. All right, so limestone bedrock was the most popular material used during the settlement area and all through to the present day. Now, these are very good for construction because it was relatively flat to begin with, so it would stack pretty easily. And we see a lot of structures, they don't even use concrete or cement to hold them together. They're what's called dry stack or dry laid. Simply the weight of the one rock on top of another and the roughness of the rocks holds them together, keeps them from sliding apart. Or we can find some of the spring houses and rock-built buildings. The rock was put together with cement. And that was, again, mostly the more affluent people would use mortared rock. Some of the rock was just used basically as was, but when we had skilled masons involved, they would usually shape the rock, square it off, make it look actually rather pretty in a building. Okay, here's a typical rock wall of the type that we see all through the bluegrass. Now, for a long time, tradition held that these rock fences had been built by slave labor, but research by Carl Rates and Carolyn Woolley, they published a book some years ago called Rock Fences of the Bluegrass, and by looking at the records of various farms and settlements, they were able to determine that these rock fences were actually built by skilled Scots-Irish masons. So they built houses, rock houses, they built rock walls, and they also built spring houses and other outbuildings on properties. Here's an example of a dry laid rock structure. This is a wall in a spring house. And the rocks have been, roughly dressed, squared off. Now, here's some examples of some that have been put together, been shaped by expert masons, squared off and mortared. This is good work. This is good construction here. Now, I'm going to give you an example from Bourbon County. This is an old rock house that was built before 1800. I don't know exactly when. I have not yet been able to find out any history behind this house, but I haven't really made a concerted effort to talk to any of the historians in Bourbon County yet, but it's one that's pretty high on my list. I want to find out more about this house. But I'm showing it because of I'm going to give you a more distant view of this house, and you can see what's below it there. A spring structure. This was a typical settlement. They would build the house on high ground, and then their water supply was a little bit lower down, water discharging from the side of the hill. So, a typical morning routine would be a few people would go down and carry water back to the house, for cooking and washing and whatever needs, other domestic needs. Now, I came up with a classification scheme for spring house modifications, but you have to sort of take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, because some of these categories overlap a little bit. For example, the boundary between a spring box and a walled pool is a little bit fuzzy. And there are, like I said, spring houses are entirely up to the imagination of the owner and their budget. And so there are some spring houses that have been built that entirely defy any sort of classification. They're totally unique. For example, there's a spring house in Frankfurt that looks like an Egyptian obelisk. It looks like the Washington Monument. It's about 6 feet square, about 25 feet high, and comes to a point at the top. Has a couple of windows in it and a spring coming out the bottom. Why they built it like that, I have no idea, but that was the owner's idea of what to do. There are other spring houses that look like Greek temples. I've seen some pictures of them online. Haven't actually visited one personally, but there are some really elaborate spring houses in Kentucky. All right, so let me kind of run you through these, and then we'll look at some real-life examples. Okay, there we go. All right, here's simply a dammed spring. The spring might be buried beneath the water, covered up by the dammed flow. and so the water comes out. This provides a good watering hole for livestock. Kind of a minimal modification. Then I mentioned gravity reservoirs, such as are used in the more mountainous areas. Well, actually, these can be built anywhere that there's sufficient slope. The spring comes out of the hillside. Usually a plastic pipe will bring the water down to the water tank, and then the water is pumped from the tank by an electrical pump, or it may be, if the valley is deep enough, if there's enough slope to the land, it might just be gravity flow down to the household. Okay, here's an example of an open spring box. We saw that with the old Bourbon County house a moment ago. This particular one I show being built of concrete block. Sometimes they put a cover on top. Okay, here's an example of a walled pool. Now, these can be really big. Some of them are more than 100 feet, across, width and length. And I think the main distinction between a spring box and a walled pool is that with the spring box, the water really just flows out of the box. But in a spring pool, the water may be pooled several feet deep, like a little pond. Then we come to some of the more elaborate constructions. A simple spring house. This is what I'd call a mini spring house. It might only be 2 or 3 feet high, but it's been built on the plan of a house. So I go ahead and call that a spring house. Here's a rather rare type, but I have seen 2 of them in Kentucky, so I can call it a kind or a type, I suppose. One of them is in Anderson County. And in 1 to 1.5 story spring houses, this is probably the most common kind of spring house. The upper story usually used for, possibly storage, or not used at all. Now, the source of the water may be by going into the spring house. Could you see this little hidden spring chamber within the spring house? Okay, multi-room spring houses. Different rooms may be used for different purposes or storing different things. Multi-story spring houses, getting fancier and more expensive yet. And then another kind of rare type, but I imagine there's probably a few dozen of these in Kentucky, is where a house was built on top of the spring. This was not always a good idea because it would tend to make the house a bit damp. Some people proposed that they did this in order to protect the water supply, have it conveniently accessible in case of Indian attack. But this doesn't really hold up because such structures weren't built until well after the threat from Indian attack had long been over in Kentucky. These are structures dating from the 1800s into the 1900s. Okay, so that's the various types in my perhaps oversimplified classification scheme. Okay, so let's look at a few of the actual ones. Now, these photographs were mostly taken in 1998 and 1999 in Scott County, and so the property owners may have changed during that time. That's like almost 30 years ago. But the addresses and the names given were what I learned at that time. So here's an unmodified spring being used by livestock. Okay, here is a spring box, a simple spring box. Now, cattle are hard on these structures. They walk in and out of these spring boxes and they knock against the rock walls and they knock them down. So they do take some constant maintenance. And after the spring has less value, or if the owner simply doesn't want to be bothered with repairing it because the cattle can still get at the water, the spring boxes or structures will deteriorate over time. Like I said, cattle are very hard on these kind of structures. Here's a more elaborate one. This is on, I believe, on US 25. Yeah, US 25, and it's quite visible from the road if you drive down the highway. You know, some historic structures also associated with it. For example, this, what the owner told me, what used to be a former slave jail on the property. Okay, here's a spring box with a cover. If you want me to slow down on any of these or go back to one, I'm happy to do so. Sorry?
No, I'm looking at it. It says Canewood Golf Course.
Yeah. Now, at the time that I saw it, they were just getting started on that. The golf course didn't exist yet; it was just a plan, and so they were starting to repair this old spring box. As you can see, this isn't really impounding a pool of any depth here, so that's why I consider it to be a spring box. The water just running out rather than being impounded. Now, here's one from Bourbon County, one of the bigger spring pools. And there's actually a little spring box in the back wall, which is where the spring discharges from. They've also got a real nice spring house elsewhere on the property. I didn't put in a picture of it because it's Bourbon County. I'm using a few examples from Bourbon just where I don't have a particular example of something I want to show from Scott County. Okay, here's one up near Stamping Ground on White Oak Road. This is a spring house or mini spring house, being roofed over. This is one that probably dates back to the early 1800s or even earlier, but more recently, and by recently it could be any time in the late 19th century up to the present day, the owners have improved it by adding concrete. Okay, another composite mini spring house. This one was looks like it was originally built out of rock, and then the owner formed in some concrete for the front and dropped a rock slab on top of it. Okay, this is a fairly new spring house. What's really neat about it is that the roof is completely formed in one piece out of concrete. Don't see that too often. Here's a real elegant little spring house. Back in the background is the pump house that goes with it. Now, a lot of these pictures during 1999, that was a very dry year. And so most of the springs were rather dry. They didn't have much flow coming out of them. Now, here's a very historic site in Scott County. This is the Choctaw Indian Academy. And there are school buildings on top of the hill, but if you go look over at the bottom of the hill, you can find the spring that was the water supply for the Indian children and instructors that boarded there. Now, judging from those pillars in the corners, I'm guessing that it probably had a wooden structure built over top of it. This, at one time, was a very nice spring house. Here's one of the school buildings up on top. Here's one of my favorite spring houses in Scott County. It's perhaps not as elegant as some, but it's just so picturesque. This is the kind of thing that you can just imagine people coming down and maybe stepping inside to cool off on a hot day, dipping a little water. It's been modified in the 20th century. They built a little brick pump house structure inside the spring house. Here's one of my drawings from the reporting form. This is I guess I've got a pointer here. I forgot about that. Let's see. It'll take me a second to make it work, if I can make it work at all. Other way around? Yay, okay, good. All right, this area right here, that's a low wall on the opposite side. You can't see it in this shot, but that's a low wall where the doorway into the spring house was. That's the little brick pump house. It's only about 3 or 4 feet high. and then the water discharging from the front. Okay. Now, a number of spring houses, there's not a great deal left of them. There was an even more elaborate spring house in Bourbon County, from what I could tell, what was left of it. It was an extremely well-built spring house, but it was almost completely tumbled down. It had several rooms. It had a spring chamber in the back. It had some excellent stonework associated with it, but the roof was gone, and the walls are almost all broken down. So here's an example of a spring house that is feeding into a dammed pond. And there's a close-up of what's left of the spring house. You can see they put some work into shaping those blocks. That is a mortarless construction, dry stacked rock. But they very carefully shaped those blocks and fit them together. So, when I'm talking about spring houses, you have to also apply the construction techniques to other structures that were on a farm. Okay, now here's one of the most unusual spring houses that I've seen. Again, it has a formed concrete roof, but it's I'll show you a close-up picture of it. You can see just how amazing it is. Somebody put a lot of work and a lot of skill into building that. Now, a little diagram. That area right there where the spring comes out, if it didn't have water coming out of it, you would swear it was a fireplace. I mean, it's built just to look like a fireplace, except for a mantle, but you can see the kind of lintel area there has got a kind of a keystone arch, and then water discharging through a slot at the bottom and coming out the front of the spring house here. Okay, there's a view of the front. Notice the structures up on the top. Now, I'm not as adept at historical archaeology as I might be, but are those Georgian structures? I think somebody told me that they were.
Greek revival.
Huh?
It's Greek revival.
Greek revival? Okay. Okay, there's an example of a smokehouse on the same farm on the hill up above the spring house. Now, I've got so many springs that I haven't really been able to dig deeply into the history of all of them, only a handful. But I do have a book in mind on springs of the bluegrass that maybe I'll get done one day. Just got too many projects. Okay, here we can see the relative location of the spring house here and the smokehouse on the hill up above it. Okay, here's another rather interesting one. I think I interpreted this structure as being a cow barn. And off to the left side was the spring house, with water flowing out from the bottom. My best guess as to what that structure was, when I first came across it, I just kind of went, wow, this is cool. Okay, this is a spring house that today is encompassed by the urban growth of Georgetown, completely surrounded. But not then, not in 1999. Very historic structure. This is where it's located now. None of that was there when I saw it back in '99. All right, so Israel Grant, who claimed the land there, was a nephew of Daniel Boone. Built a 3-story log house there about 1786. Now, some of you may have heard of Barton Stone. He founded the Christian church here in Georgetown. Later merged with the, oh goodness, can't think of his name right now, Alexander Campbell. Yeah, okay. And he printed out pamphlets in the basement of that house. Now, my best guess would be that Grant probably built that spring house. And so it served as domestic supply. Milk was cooled inside on rocks that were set below the water line. Now only used for cattle, and to the owner's recollection, when I talked to him, it had never gone dry. Here's a better view of it. Again, a very, very good construction, very well done. Okay, you can see it's got an external spring there that actually runs through the spring house and also flows around to the side there. Now this is a 2-story spring house, or story and a half maybe. Had a wooden floor, but the owner had used it to store hay in, and the weight of it proved to be too much for the floor. It collapsed in. So a spring house is still fine, it just doesn't have a floor for the upper story. There, we can see the lintel on the back window or back door there. You know, again, this is basically how they were able to build with rock. If you have an opening, you've got to have something to span that opening to set the rock on. And this was a dry stack construction. There's no concrete used in this building. Now we come to where we started in the very beginning. The Buford Spring House, the one that I think is one of the best examples of spring house architecture that I've seen. Notice the watercress out from the front. Watercress is edible. It's used in salads, and it prefers the cool water coming out of springs. So if you see watercress, usually it's growing in spring water. Or if you see spring water, you might find some watercress. I know that McConnell Spring in Lexington has watercress growing down its length. All right, so this is a multi-room spring house. The main room is in front, and then it has a spring chamber in the back that is open on both sides. Okay, this is the location. The spring up there in the upper right, the Buford Duke House, which I'll talk about in a moment. And the water flows across the property and then sinks. Now, my friend Larry Spangler, who did his master's thesis in geology in Scott County, traced that water to Royal Spring. That's where it comes out. Royal Spring takes water from a lot of different places. Okay, this is a photograph that was included in Ann Bolton Bevan's application for National Register status for the house. And this is what it looked back when the property was a little less neglected. Abraham Buford settled in Scott County in 1792, and he built that large brick house on the hill. It was called Richland, and it was known far and wide. He evidently was a leading turfman, bred thoroughbred horses, was part of the social circles of the gentry, and the spring house would be my best guess was built about the same time as the main house. Now, when Buford died in 1833, the farm was inherited by his son-in-law, James K. Duke, who is also a well-known thoroughbred breeder who added on to the house, enlarged it a bit. Some of you may have heard of his son, Basil Duke, who served in the Confederate Cavalry, second in command to John Hunt Morgan. I'm going to show you a few construction details from that house. Here's the back door of it. It had a probably oak maybe, shake shingles on the roof. Now, when I first saw this house in 1999, the roof joists were in pretty good shape. The roof itself was starting to show a bit of wear. And when I saw it 5 or 10 years later, the roof had collapsed. This is such a historic structure that it's really a shame that it has not been restored. It may be. I mean, I haven't seen it in probably 20 years. So hopefully the owner thought it was worthwhile to do something with this. Okay, here's the interior of the building. And this is sort of a plan view. Had a spring chamber. In the back here, water came out from underneath rock ledges, and then it was open on this side and that side. Over here it had a nice platform of flat rocks that you could put milk cans or baskets of fruit and vegetables and so on to try to keep them as long as possible in hot weather. Then the water flowed through the building, came through the wall and through a slot, flowed through and came out the other side. Now, they may have used in here for cold storage, or it may be that this area was not used for storage, but was simply a good place to come down and sit and dangle your feet in the water. Who knows? Okay, here's a view of the one side of the spring chamber. And again, look at the construction. That's, a lot of time and effort went into shaping that rock. This one is cemented together. Here's a detail of one of the side windows. And here's what I really like. Look at that lintel, how that was constructed with a keystone there. And this may not even be needed. That may have only been put up there just long enough to set those stones in place, because that keystone construction will support itself. If I remember correctly, and Ron, you may know something about this, wasn't the staircase in the old Capitol building built kind of on this principle? Am I right about that? Okay. Okay, a more modern spring house. This one was built in 1915. But it's a two-story spring house. It may be multiple rooms. I did not go inside of it, but it is not being used at present, but it was a domestic supply for the household and the farm up to about 1980, until they got water lines run into that area. Now, here's one of the ones that where we have a house built on top of a spring. There's a set of stairs going down into the basement right here, down into a cellar, so to speak. And in the back of the cellar is a pool of water from the spring. And I talked to the farm manager who's been with the property for a very long time. He told me that the owner used to be in the dairy business, and when he would do the milking for the farm, he would set maybe a half a dozen or so cans of milk in that cellar to keep cool until the milk company would come by and pick them up. And Jenkins, who was the farm manager, he drove a milk truck during the 1940s. He said he usually would pick up about 10 5-gallon milk cans every day from that cellar. And I imagine that was probably 7 days a week, since I don't think cows take breaks. Now, here's one from Anderson County that I had to throw in because it was just so neat. This is another house built on top of a spring. It's originally a log house, but the owner decided to cover it with clapboard. I think that in recent years that clapboard has been taken off and the building restored, but basically you can see the little door right there, and then open right here. Basically you just walk in and there's a pool of water, and water flowing out the front door. That was I guess they just thought they wanted to be able to protect the spring by setting their house on top of it. Again, maybe not a good idea as far as fostering damp conditions inside the house. Okay, now that is all that I have for my presentation. I'll be glad to take any questions anybody might have.
Are you able to see any of these spring houses from the road at all?
Yeah, almost every single one of these was visible from the road. Some of them it required driving on very little roads and a few farm roads, but almost all of these spring houses were clearly visible at the time that I was cruising through Scott County. That's why I said I was doing a windshield survey in Scott County. And then later, when I turned my attention to Bourbon County, I decided, well, I'm going to do a more thorough job in Bourbon County. And so I basically just went door to door, knocked on doors, saying, do y'all have any springs on your property? And pretty much everybody was friendly, willing to talk about their springs or spring houses. I didn't run into anybody that ordered me off their property, which was nice. Okay, yes, sir.
Where would you say that most of those were found within Scott County? So several were around Painted Depot, all those kinds of things. Was there a centralized area?
No, they're scattered all over.
That you realize? Okay.
No, scattered all over.
Well, like how many would you say were in a certain
Not really, because I mean, you had some large farms that were out some distance from Georgetown, and some of those owners were extremely wealthy and put a lot of money into their, the buildings on their property. So, I mean, I've got latitude and longitude for every spring, and I probably should have put that in here. I do actually have a map that was created for me by a friend who's a GIS expert that plots the locations of all the springs in Scott County and Bourbon County. But I should have put it on the slideshow, but I didn't. But it's pretty much scattered across the counties. There's pretty much all of Scott County, except possibly the very most northernmost part of it, is all limestone country. From about 2/3 of the way up, that's limestone. And then we start moving into a less favorable sort of geology. So all that lower part of Scott County is limestone country, and you're going to find springs dotted all over it.
I got one more. If that's
Okay, sure.
So, if you were just talking about,
Yeah. Excuse me, I'm going to sit down.
you were just talking about people should be taking care of these things. How should somebody, if they do have a spring on their property, how should they preserve it? Is there a certain?
Well, ideally, there are some expert masons in central Kentucky who have been restoring some of the rock walls around the country, around this area. And if it is a major spring house, something that is an important historic structure, those would probably be the people to come in to repair it. If it's just some say spring box or something very small that is more functional than aesthetic, well, this is just the owner should do something with it, if it's not real historically significant, then, probably not worth the effort. But, some of these big spring houses like the Buford Spring House or the Grant Spring House, which fortunately is in very good condition, those are things that we should try to preserve as part of our historical heritage. You got a question?
A couple of things. The one behind Rose Kelly's house on Stanton Road, he calls that the Blue Spring for what that's worth.
Yeah, Blue Spring.
The other thing is, the ones that's got some wood structure in there with lintels and things, you mentioned oak, I'm kind of wondering, I'm thinking they might be chestnut.
Well, it could be. There was an awful lot of chestnut in Kentucky until the blight hit early in the 20th century. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Yes. Did you say you wanted me to talk about it? Yeah, Royal Spring is the largest spring in central Kentucky. There are some larger springs elsewhere in Kentucky, but it is definitely the largest one in the dozen or so counties that make up the inner bluegrass region. It has the groundwater that feeds into the spring has its origins in northern Fayette County, actually inside New Circle Road. It travels that far. And for that reason, it has been periodically subject to some major contamination issues. Some of you may remember probably 25 years ago where they had to install an air stripper because it was being contaminated by gasoline from an underground storage tank somewhere. And the idea of that air stripper, it was like a waterfall cascade coming down. Anybody remember seeing that? Okay. Well, that was when I was working for Division of Water. So yes, we were very interested in it because it was a public water system. So the water company had to install this air stripper, and the idea was that by having the water tumbling down this cascading waterfall, it was a structure made out of metal, that the volatiles, the gasoline, benzene, toluene, those other volatile chemicals would vaporize out of the water. So, they would basically tumble it over and over again to try and get as much of it out possible to get it down to levels that were acceptable health-wise, to get rid of as much as possible. But it was a major headache and a major problem. Another problem with Royal Spring is, and this again is something that came out when I was working with Division of Water, but probably didn't get a lot of publicity, is that the Kentucky Horse Park was sinking wells in order to water their grass, and they sunk a lot of wells, and some of them hit the main bore for Royal Spring, and they were sucking out the Royal Spring water, not leaving enough for Georgetown, making sure that the horse park's grass stayed green. And so they had eventually to shut down those wells and Horse Park get its water from somewhere else. But I remember that there were a lot of studies being done by the Kentucky Geological Survey, and some of the people in my office were involved in that. And it was kind of neat in that they were using a technology called electrical resistivity to determine where underground the Royal Spring conduit was. And it's a little technical, but the long and short of it is that electricity travels easily through some materials, but other materials it's very resistant. So if you set up a series of stakes across an area where you think Royal Springs underground conduit is, and you send an electrical current into the ground, you get a feedback from a computer that shows the areas underground where there's high resistivity to flow of electricity and areas where it flows easily. So if you have an air-filled conduit underground, that's not going to transmit electricity. It'll show up as very resistant to electrical flow. On the other hand, if you have a water-filled conduit, it's going to be extremely low resistivity. Water transmits electricity very easily, and so it will have a lower resistivity than the surrounding bedrock. So by using that technique, they can sort of map out where the conduit actually travels underground through the horse park or elsewhere. And I've seen a couple of studies that were done that plotted out the location of the Royal Spring tube as it goes through the horse park. Now, most of the water that feeds Royal Spring comes down Cane Run, but Cane Run is almost always dry. If you've looked at my book, I've got some photographs in there. I took a picture of Cane Run inside the horse park in March, and it was just after a rain, and it was full of water. It was in flood. It was just flowing, just tremendous flow of water in it. I came back 2 weeks later and photographed the same spot, and it was bone dry. That's because the bed of Cane Run has a lot of fissures and holes in it that drain water into the underground conduits that feed into Royal Spring. And so after rain, you've got water coming in, the runoff's coming in faster than those holes can take it away, and so you have flow in Cane Run. But as soon as it stops raining, then the water's still draining underground through the bed of Cane Run, and eventually, there's no more flow in the bed. Now, the water of Cane Run takes off away from Royal Spring off to the west toward Great Crossings, and at that point, that's a little bit just west of Georgetown, there is continuous flow in Cane Run throughout the year. But the rest of Cane Run, all the way back to Lexington, is always dry, because Royal Spring is taking the water. Let's see, anything else? Now, I was telling you about it physically. Did you want to know history or? Okay. Now, also interesting is that right next door to Royal Spring and emerging from a large spring just west of Great Crossing is another very large groundwater system. And this one has a large cave that can actually be entered and explored. It's called Slacks Cave. It is on the Tuttle property. I think it's Cecil Tuttle, if anybody knows him, but know him? Yeah. I'm sorry, what? Alvin Tuttle, okay. And it has a 7,000-foot-long cave that has passageways in it that are as high as this room and probably in some places 25, 30 feet wide. It has a substantial stream of water inside of it. And that cave is of particular interest because a newspaper account of that cave appeared in the Kentucky Gazette in 1790. The very first report and description of a cave in Kentucky was that particular one. The man who owned it, a fellow named Garnett, I believe, the paper reported that he'd lost a cow, and so he went looking for it inside the cave. And he had a boat built and went up in the cave for about 3/4 of a mile, where they finally found the calf and brought it back out to the entrance. Now, I have a suspicion that the calf really wasn't worth all that much trouble, and he just wanted to go caving. Now, there is a friend of mine, and I wish I could remember his last name right now, but I can't. I haven't talked to him in a number of years, Jim something or another. But where that spring comes out on Elkhorn is now nothing but rubble. It rises through rock rubble. And so my friend Jim told me that a number of years ago, and I hadn't told him this story about the calf in Garnett, but he said that some years ago that the property owner had dynamited that entrance because cattle kept wandering into the cave. So it makes sense. Anybody else have any questions? Yes, sir.
The large spring house you showed with looked like a house on top of it.
Yeah.
Were you ever in it?
No, I was not inside of it.
Could it have been a laundry?
It'd been what?
A laundry.
Washing clothes.
I wouldn't think so. It was pretty cramped inside.
I mean, they would have the kettles and all inside to heat the water. And upstairs.
Oh, there it is. Not that one?
Early in your program.
Early in the program.
Yeah. Back to the beginning.
I'm kind of running out of spring houses. Did you see what you were thinking of?
You have the name to it.
Okay. Well, that's the first slide.
It had, the first floor was stone, and then it had a wooden structure.
Oh, yeah, that was the Grant Spring House. Yeah. I don't know. One account that I read, and I don't think it was true for that particular spring house, but one spring house they used an upper story for storing hams. They'd hang hams up in there. Huh?
It needs to be dry, doesn't it, for me?
That's what I would have thought. I don't know anything about curing hams, and maybe the person who told me that didn't know anything about it either. I mean, that's just what he told me. That's all I know. It's hard to speculate. I mean, if you have an area, if you have a building on your farm, and you have an upper story, and it's going to be relatively cool, it could be used for a lot of things, I suppose.
But there's one at Shaker Village on their property. It was a big laundry. And they had the kettles and all,
Mm-hmm.
far within the side of it.
Well-
And then upper story was if it happened to be a rainy day when you were doing the clothes.
If it was a big enough space, yeah. It would have to be a pretty good sized space, I think. And of course, if you're going to have a kettle of boiling water, I wouldn't put it on a wooden floor myself. Now, I do know, you're talking about boiling kettles and laundry. There is a spring in eastern Fayette County. It's on Cave Hill Farm. And this is out the Athens Walnut Hill Road, out going toward the Richmond area, out near where I-75 comes up through there. And it was owned by a man named Samuel M. Cassidy, a wonderful man who passed away in, I think, 19 94, 96. He was 90-some years old. He was a good friend. And he lived in an elegant stone house that had been built by the first settler of that area, who was his ancestor, Robert Boggs. And Boggs had claimed that property, I think, in 1778 and built that house, I think a couple of years later, maybe 1780. And there was a cave spring. The cave wasn't a large cave. It was about 4 feet high, so it wasn't something you go exploring for fun, because you would have to like crawl in the water. But the picture of that entrance, of the cave entrance, was used as an illustration in James Lane Allen's article on the bluegrass region of Kentucky, which I think was in Harper's Magazine. And it shows a wooden kind of gate-like structure built across it and flat stones inside. It was a lithograph, not a photograph. And on the stones were milk jugs. And then Mr. Cassidy told me about how Robert Boggs and his family would have when it was time to do laundry, they would set up boiling kettles just below the cave, and they bring their laundry down, and take the water from the cave stream and boil the water and do their laundry there. And they would also have a wagon pulled by a mule that would haul water from the cave up to the house, which was on a hill about maybe 400 feet up from the cave itself. So that kind of gives a picture of how at least one family did laundry. I mean, I can't really answer your questions about what were they using the upper stories of the spring houses for, because I have found very little that has been written about them. There are a few books from the 19th century which are about farmhouse building plans. In other words, you could look at them and you could see plans on how to build barns and other structures on a farm. But those are late 19th century. I don't know about things that were being done in the early 19th century, because it was, everyday life is not always something that gets written about because everybody's already familiar with it. That's one of the puzzles for historians, is trying to figure out, not what were the rich and powerful doing, because, they get written about a lot, but what was everybody else, the ordinary, men and women living their daily lives. How do we figure out what their lives were like when there was very little written about it? One of the solutions to that is through the work of historical archaeologists who can go in and excavate different sites, such as Nancy O'Malley has done with Boonesboro and Boone Station, to look at what sort of household items were dropped and buried and accumulated in the soil over the years, and then lost in the cracks and crevices of buildings, and be able to analyze, dish fragments and, bits of scrap metal that may have been parts of guns or, dining utensils, to try to figure out how did everyday people lived during an era that is centuries removed from our own. This is one of the things that makes history so fascinating and archaeology so fascinating. It's, I consider myself as much a detective as I do a historian, because what I do is what detectives do. You have to assemble the evidence and draw a probable conclusion from that. And sometimes it's just your best guess, and you have to say, well, I think this is what they were doing. Anybody else have anything?
A spring house like that, it serviced several families.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just one.
Yeah, some of them would. I know there is a spring house that I saw, and I think this was in Bourbon County also. It was built on the side of the road, and it was a very nice spring house. It was built in the, I think, the 19-teens, and has a name on it even. It's a name or a plaque on it. And the property owner told me that it served the neighborhood. It wasn't just for his house, that it served an entire neighborhood until the city water was brought in. And I think you had a question back here?
You were talking about the recharge area in Oxford for Royal Springs.
Yes.
You began in 1990, is that correct? When you started doing this?
I started researching Royal Spring. Actually, I have to go back. It's probably, I'm sorry, I've got like 60 years of memories about this stuff, and sometimes I can't pin down a year, but I basically started when Larry Spangler, who was a graduate student under Dr. Thrillkill at the University of Kentucky, and he did his geology thesis in northern Fayette County and southern Scott County, and his work was dye tracing the groundwater aquifers in the region. And Dr. Thrillkill suggested that I contact Larry because I was already familiar with a lot of the caves and the situation in the area, that we ought to get together. And so I started going with Larry on his field work, and we became very good friends, and we still correspond to this day, even though he lives in Utah now. But so I started going around with him, and he was the first one to bring me to Royal Spring, and I think that was, in fact, about 1990. That's the first time that I actually saw it. And I started researching Royal Spring because I was in the process of writing a book about the historic springs and caves of Fayette County. That's still a work in progress. Been working on it for 30 years. I work slow, but things eventually get done.
I bring that up because in 1990 was when I became interested in the spring and the commissioner of the local water company.
Uh-huh.
Worked with Dr. Thrillkill.
Okay.
And we had a drought, and we were having a difficult time producing enough water for the community and was purchasing it from other people. And we were dye tracing to see where the aquifer was, and that's how we got into him.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, during this drought, we're trying to really protect the water for the community. It went dry one night. I mean, quick.
Yeah.
Just quick, in hours. And we called Frankfurt, and they sent helicopters to find out what was going on. And a local tobacco farmer, large tobacco farmer, had gone out west and purchased a large pump and sunk it at the well out on Barton Brothers farm, which you're speaking of, that out there.
Yeah, that's where that last spring house,
As soon as
Barton
they
Brothers.
turned that pump on, Royal Springs went dry.
Ah.
Completely dry. And we luckily, the state used some arm twisting, I guess, because they weren't really interested in turning that pump off. They were irrigating the tobacco. But we had a lot of constituents that liked to have a shower. They did turn it off, but they, when they sold that property, that farm to the, I think I'm telling you right, when they sold that farm to the, parts of that farm to the horse farm,
Mm-hmm.
they carved out that well where all that water goes right through. It's still there today, and it's still there today.
Yeah, Kentucky operates under riparian law, which, not a legal scholar. I actually researched it to write Bluegrass Paradise, but right now I'm kind of at a loss as to how to interpret what the legal implications are of that being pulling water out. I mean, in the West, they have the first, basically, first in time kind of thing. The first person to take the water has more or less a perpetual right to it. But I believe in Kentucky, the person taking water cannot damage the supply of downstream users, if I remember right. I might. What's that?
Not supposed to impede the natural flow.
Yeah, not supposed to impede the natural flow. Thank you. But it's kind of a sticky question that would either require some of that arm twisting or be resolved in the courts.
Luckily, it was, they abided by the rules.
Was that Walnut Hall Farm? Part of Walnut Hall Farm? that they had?
Before you get to it, it's on Barton Brothers, right off of I-70.
Oh, on Barton, okay.
Right there, close to West Spring.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I remember back when I was there also when the Benson came into the
Oh, yeah.
system, and we went and bought those air strippers.
station, and the one that's the convenience store for about,
Well, I was going to try to come back to the Barton property, which I don't want to run through 50 slides again to get there, and I can't make that thing work over there. Is he?
Barton, Lyle Road, Barton Brothers is on Lyle Road, but it also goes under the, right? You gotta enter it, it goes under the railroad track.
Yeah.
Well, we're glad you came with us tonight.
Oh, so am I, and I've enjoyed the.